Welcome to the Blue Mouse Knits. Today I'm going to teach you how to knit a gauge swatch to match a pattern's gauge. This formula works for any yarn weight, any needle size, but I'm specifically going to try and match gauge for a pattern that calls for worsted weight yarn, and it has 17 stitches and 25 rows per 4 inches or 10 centimeters, and it's worked flat. So I like to make swatches that are bigger than what the gauge is, because your edge stitches on any of your gauge swatches are going to be a little bit more scrunched than the rest of your swatch. So you want to kind of account for that so that you have a good section in the middle that is a normal size. I like to usually add at least 10 stitches, if not double the amount of stitches cast on for the gauge swatch. Now, if you're working with super thin yarn that calls for something like 25 or 30 stitches per 4 inches, you don't necessarily have to double it. You could add 10, 15 stitches, something like that, so that you have a little bit of a buffer on each side. But when working with something that is 20 stitches or less, I usually double it. So I have to meet a 17 stitch gauge, so I'm going to cast on 34. And you can just use whatever your favorite cast on method is, or if you've already bought the pattern, you can see what the cast on method is for the pattern. So here I have my 34 stitches. The gauge swatch is worked in stockinette, so I'm just going to turn my work and purl across. And then the same rule applies for the number of rows. My gauge swatch says that 25 rows is equal to 4 inches. So again, you don't have to necessarily double it. I would add at least 10 rows. So instead of working 25, I'm going to work 35. I usually find that with rows, they are less scrunched at the top and bottom of your swatch than your stitches are at the edges. So I don't feel like you have to add as many. So here I'm only going to add 10 instead of doubling it. So we're going to work 35 rows or close to it. Here's my cast on edge. I don't work any rows of garter at the beginning and end of a stockinette swatch, and I don't add any garter stitches at the edging either, because it can tend to kind of slightly warp the size of your swatch. It might scrunch it up a little bit or scrunch it in a little bit, and that will change your gauge. So I just leave it a little ruffled at the edge. I flipped it over and kind of pinned it gently when I blocked it, just so that the edges were a little bit more flat. I didn't pull. So the edges are a little bit curled, which is why you add extra stitches, because these can't really be counted because they're folded in and they're a little bit of a different size than the rest of our stitches. And when you get to the end of your swatch, I never bind off either. I always take a piece of waste yarn and thread it through all of my remaining stitches, because again, your bind off can tend to kind of pull your swatch in, or it can widen your swatch, and that will change the shape of everything below it. So in order to avoid it, I just put it on waste yarn. You can tie knots into the waste yarn that you put your stitches on so that you easily remember what size needle you are working with. So for this specific swatch, I used a US 10 because there are 10 knots here. So you have a V like this, that makes up one stitch. Looks like this. You've got a left leg and a right leg. So you want to start counting on the left side of a V, and as close as you can, you just lay it down. Try not to disturb the fabric too much, but you just lay it down and then you measure across. And I always try and find one that evenly lands, either at the end of a full stitch or halfway in the middle exactly. So if we look here, you can tell that my 6th inch mark is in between exactly 2 stitches. So I'm going to count how many stitches there are in between my 0 and that 6. 22 stitches per 6 inches. And then I would write that down. So I do this with every swatch. 22 stitches equals 6 inches. Now you might be saying, but we only need 4 inches. That's where I take a whole bunch of different measurements and I write everyone down, and then I take an average. So I've started over here, so now let's start a little bit further in and up a couple stitches, and let's count to 4 inches here because we can get to a full end of a stitch. 15 stitches equals 4 inches, and I just keep doing that. So I go down a little bit. Again, I avoid the very top and the very bottom because it's kind of curled, and I avoid the very edges that are also curled. Okay, so my 7th stitch is in between 2, so I can count across. 26 stitches equals 7 inches. So I would do this a couple more times and see if I can get a consensus on how many there are in 6 inches or 4 inches or 7 inches or something like that. Sometimes counting 4 inches will give you the wrong amount. It might be kind of a wonky section and you can't get a good reading. So we take several measurements. I usually take about 5, but here I've done 3. and then I find out how many stitches are in 1 inch. So just take stitches divided by the inch amount or centimeter amount if that's what you're working with. So 22 divided by 6 is about 3.66 repeating. 15 divided by 4 is 3.75. 26 divided by 7 is 3.71. So these are fairly different. This would be how many stitches per 1 inch. So I'm going to take the average here. It'll work out better if you have more than 3 to work with, but for right now I'm going to only have 3. So 3.6 repeating plus 3.75 plus 3.71, and divide that by 3, and we get 3.7 exactly. So this is stitches per 1 inch, and then we multiply that by 4, and I get 14.84. But now that we've checked our stitches, we can check our rows. So I do the same process. Take my measuring tape and I measure down until I can find the edge of a bottom stitch. Again, right here is 1 stitch. It looks like a V, so this is the top of it right here, and this is the bottom of it right here. So I start at the top of where those 2 V's meet, and I count down. So that 5 ends up right at the 27 mark, really. So 27 rows equals 5 inches, and I just do that the same way that we did for our stitches. We do multiple different lengths and we move around a little bit so we get a variety. So the same thing that we did with our stitches, we're going to divide our row count by the inches or centimeters. So 27 divided by 5 is 5.4, 33 divided by 6 is 5.5, and 22 divided by 4 is 5.5. So much closer here, but we're still going to take an average. So add these together and divide by 3, and we get 5.46. Multiply that by 4, and I get 21.86. But if we took this and we rounded it and did 5.5 times 4, we would get 22 exactly. So with a little bit of rounding, we get the exact. Because this is 4.6 repeating, I'm going to round this to 5.5 and multiply it by 4 to get 22 rows. We end up with very close to 15 stitches. So I'm going to say 15 stitches and 22 rows. That's my current gauge. Now let's say that I need to have 17 stitches and 24 rows. I have too few stitches, so I need to go down a needle size, because if your stitches are smaller, you'll have more of them in the same amount of space. But if your goal is, let's say, 12 stitches by 18 rows, then you want to go up a needle size. Because you have too many stitches, your stitches are too small so that you have more that fit in a space than 12. If you go up a needle size, your stitches will get bigger and you'll have less of them in a certain amount of space. You have too few, go down a needle size. You have too many, go up a needle size. And when you're first starting out and you're not sure, you want to start out with a similar yarn to the pattern and the same size needle as the pattern, and cast on around twice as many as the gauge says, or at least 10 extra. And then with the rows, add at least 10, if not more like 15 or 16 extra, and you should be good to start your swatch. I hope you guys found that video helpful. If you did, please give it a like, and I have a more in-depth video on how swatching works, how to work it for projects in the round. If you're interested, I will link it below.